think you can now see my screen. Okay, let's get started. Cue intro. So thanks everyone for coming. Really happy to be here, and thanks to everyone for hosting. So today I'm going to talk about how to build and grow analytics functions from the ground up. And I think it's an interesting subject because everyone seems to have a very different take on it. If you look at all the case studies online, everyone has a different take. If you look at the landscape of companies that are offering you services and products, there's a million of them. And how do you build the right roadmap? How do you pick the right products? Even myself, when I look at, let's say nowadays, looking at the types of data warehouses you can implement, just one piece of the puzzle, there's all these different companies, each with a slightly different opinion on how it should be done. So it's complicated. Today, I'm going to share with you guys a little bit about my own career, some lessons learned, and hopefully what you guys can take away is a framework for thinking about the decisions that you make while growing out these functions. And hopefully you guys can take away that to your own companies and kind of better data and data culture, outside. So again, thanks for coming. Let's get started. Experienced directors. And the experienced hires that we did make, a lot of their large company experience didn't exactly apply because the things that they were used to, these like shiny, large data warehouses managed by large data engineering teams with QA, well-built data processes, that wasn't available to them. So we all kind of learned through experimentation, trying different things, sometimes just doing it and asking for forgiveness later. So kind of learning from first principles and seeing, what works when, you start from the ground. And I've been pretty fortunate. Some highlights so far, I was able to, like Jacqueline said, build up data analytics from the ground up twice at 2 different companies and make major impact there. And then later on, learn how to make data-driven decisions. And during my last time at Wish, I was a manager, so hiring and growing data teams. So enough about that. Let's get started about, my time at 500. So at 500 Pixels, I joined as a data analyst, and it's a very simple timeline. First, I joined. My goal was to kind of help people access data. So I was doing a lot of data pulls, a lot of simple data analysis. This would be like querying MySQL and getting sales per week, kind of breaking that down by different dimensions, helping with reporting, executive reporting, and so forth. So after about 3 months of this, I'm super lazy, and these are a lot of like repetitive manual tasks that I was doing out of like SQL and Python. So I thought to myself, there has to be an easier way that I could just automate all of this. And at the time, Redshift was getting pretty popular. This was what I read about is like this database that offered, just throw in data and we'll just aggregate it for you. And you can write aggregation queries. And instead of, joining log data to MySQL data offline, you can just dump everything in and we'll serve you queries with results back in 10 seconds or less. So that seemed really compelling. It also seemed really cheap. So accessible to implement at a startup. I was reading about Periscope and all these different cloud-based BI tools. And I thought to myself, this would actually be a pretty simple project. And it would have the potential to make things a lot easier in terms of accessing data. So I went ahead and implemented that. And at the end of my time at 500, we had self-serve data. So every team had tons of dashboards because, with this type of tooling, you can just pump out dashboards like it's nothing. And everyone had access to data, and, the impact, that was the impact. Cheers and applause. So if I was giving this presentation to you guys 2.5 years ago or 3 years ago when I first left 500, this would pretty much be the presentation. I'd go deeply into like how great self-serve analytics is and how data democratization is the be-all end-all of analytics. But since then, upon some more reflection and more work experience, I asked myself the question, and you guys the question, did this help the company win? And I put a link at the bottom, but if you want to learn more about, my time at 500, I wrote a blog post about it, which goes way more into detail than I'm going to now. So if you're interested, go check that out. But back to the question, did this actually help the company win? And thinking about it, I say not really, because if you think about it, the goal of a startup is at that point, was to grow sales, grow our user base. And I was already covering the majority of impactful analysis and data pulls, and anything else was marginal. So just giving people dashboards, giving people access to data on an ad hoc basis without some sort of prioritization, I would say is a lot less impact. Whereas I could have spent the time building out this data warehouse, instead spending it a little bit more strategically and helping projects that actually grew sales, grew users, and helped the company win. So that was a big lesson for me, and this is a very important point that I'm going to talk about in the rest of this presentation. And the answer is, what is impact from data, and then how do you do it from scratch and scale it up? So when I left 500, a bunch of companies were marketing themselves to me, and one of them was Wish. And Wish promised, hey, we're engineering led. We're our engineering staff is all like ex-Google, ex-Facebook. We're super technical, and we're very data-driven. And that seemed really attractive. So I said, hey, they probably have really good data infrastructure. I'll probably, just start working from the time of something a little bit more advanced than I had at 500, and then go from there. That'd be a natural continuation. But surprising to myself, I guess I didn't ask enough specific questions, but day one, everything was straight from MongoDB. And if you've worked with Mongo before, you'll know that it's like 10 times more painful than MySQL, the primary database I was working at 500. So in Mongo, we had one of the largest Mongo clusters in the world. For stability reasons, we couldn't run aggregation queries. This meant that kind of analysis done on it, every single row had to be sent to your client and aggregated in some sort of script. So if you wanted to do like a sum over 1 million rows, like 1 million points of sales, each one of those would have to be streamed to your desktop machine. You'd have to write code to kind of join it up and then spit out data or reports. So it's incredibly painful. Also, huge sales. Wish was doing well, still doing very well, up and to the right, billions of sales and a very small team. Having a small team meant that, minutes of work count. It's heavy on operations, and it was always go, go, go. So there wasn't a lot of free time to kind of dedicate to, strategic projects like data warehousing. So just a brief overview of my time there. First 8 months was, just stop the ship from falling over. So joining, seeing the state of the data pipeline, it's pretty much built by interns and like patched together by, pretty much every single engineer had a hand in it at some point. Failing on multiple times a day. And there wasn't any type of scheduling. Things were kind of scheduled, like things would run at 8 p.m. and then we assumed that they would finish by 11 p.m. So at midnight, another stuff would run and then so forth. And then if anything failed, then a lot of manual work had to be done in kickstarting the pipeline back up. Dealing with reporting, tons of reporting, everyone needed data, lots of bug fixes, So this made for a pretty stressful 8 months. Month 4, hired our first data analyst. So I knew the data enough that we could bring on someone with maybe slightly less technical capabilities, but more experience on the data analyst side. And my life just improved. It's still painful, but like it 10x in quality, because now I could spend a little bit of time patching up the data infrastructure. So we rebuilt the data pipeline into a workflow engine. Luigi, today, Airflow is the biggest thing. I don't think that many people are paying too much attention to Luigi anymore, but essentially the same thing. It allows you to schedule tasks that finish before other tasks and gives you retry logic and all that. So it makes this data pipeline system, the ETL system, a little bit more robust. So that stabilized things. Things were no longer failing on a day-to-day basis, and less time fighting fires. After that, you can build the data warehouse. So one of the patterns that I found is you write a bunch of reporting code, do that for a while, and then once you're ready to do the data warehouse, you can just take all the code that generates the reports that you used to build and just deaggregate them and turn them into pipelines. So that went along pretty quickly. We added Looker to make building these reports easier, so we didn't have to write Python and HTML code. So that really sped things up. And then after that, the momentum kept going, and we started adding headcount. So we improved the data infrastructure with more engineers so that data pipelines are easy to write and even writable by analysts. And then we added an analyst team and then scaled out that analyst team. So brief overview of the end results. It's about 70% of our analysts were embedded into teams, so close to the business. And 30% was in a separate org. And I'll talk about the whys later. And for data engineering, we had a 20-80 split between engineers that focused on the infrastructure, core infrastructure. For example, this is lower in the stack, so making sure that the data pipeline is correctly logging and being monitored. The right people are being alerted when tasks fail, and keeping up with major infrastructure changes. For example, one of the big ones during my time there was when the infra team put Mongo behind a service, and instead of calling Mongo directly through HTTP calls, we used RPCs. And that caused a lot of issues at scale. So dealing with those types of changes would be the 20% more technical, deeper in the stack, and then 80% would be focused on writing ETL. So abstracting away a lot reused logic that we found in the system and kind of making things a bit more clean. So comparing impact, I would say there's only one real impact here, and that's based on all of our work throughout the entire timeline. We were producing insightful analysis that made significant impact in Wish's sales and its future growth. And that's the real impact. Everything else is pretty much a vanity metric, like growing out data teams, building the analytics infrastructure. Those are vanity metrics. They don't actually relate to the success of the company. And the big lesson for me is this is the real impact. This is what people should be focused on when they think about being data driven. And then the question is, how do you think about this? How do you manage a data function so that the number one priority is making this type of impact. Actually, I realize you can't see my mouse, but I'm pointing at the third bullet point, and just highlighting that this is the end goal. And how do you do this and scale this up? So in making this presentation for you guys, I was thinking about, how do you actually, do this? What are the different, mechanisms that go into producing a data-driven culture? And I came up with 5 points, and we're going to go over each of these. So I can ask you this question. Data is kind of like, it requires a foundation of a type of company that people will actually can benefit the most from it. And in my mind, there's 2 different types of companies. One is kind of design-driven or enterprise salesy. Maybe there's only like 10 to 50 customers, and the expectations of users, the pain points of users are well understood because of the high touch points. Company B is something more consumer-oriented. So this would be a company product with a lot of users, a company with a lot of users, a lot of data being generated, and such that it's harder to go purely from gut feel or customer interactions. So data is clearly going to benefit company B the most. At company A, it can as well, but there's a ceiling. And that's what I want to highlight, is that not every company needs to be data-driven. There's a lot of successful companies that can focus on intuition and design without dedicating a ton of resources to growing analytics capabilities. So you kind of need to fit where you sit in this and think about that as a first point. And there's companies that are at high scale that are also intuition driven, but I would argue that looking at some of the recent IPOs and of companies that are doing this, maybe they're not as high performing. So data-driven company, how do you actually, if you're at one that data can benefit the most, what defines success with data? What is the start of this culture? And I would argue that it's the practice of always knowing your impact using data. This means, well, at least I wish, anytime someone started on a task, whether it's an intern, whether it's an engineer, an ops person, or the CEO, the first thing before the actual, this is what we're going to do, this feature, and this feature is this, or this project is doing this. What goes before that is, here's the impact. We're going to do this, and then the expected impact, and I'll give a few examples, is this. Here's the quantitative change in the system. And it's not always possible to do this. So when the data is not there, make an estimate. So based on my intuition, here's the expected impact of this set of work. Super simple, one line. And when you do this and you have a habit of doing this, communication changes, prioritization changes. For example, with some examples, put up, let's say customer service is going to talk to engineering and they want a bug fix or a fix for a UI flow that they're using. Well, before communicating, here's the actual experience that's broken, that's not really the important thing. The important thing is the expected impact in the system. So having a culture where communication revolves around this is super important, because after this, things can properly be prioritized. It's much easier to say, this is less impactful, so we're not going to do it for now because we're at capacity, when engineering understands the actual impact on the system versus, a story about this bug on an individual user. As well, communication up and down the chain. For example, if engineering was requesting a change, if logistics was requesting a change in the system and they needed approval from, say, different departments, just starting with this makes things super easy to decide, whether it should be carried out. So this would be an example of a potential policy change. And lastly, being data-driven goes even to headcount hiring. Collecting data on tasks, on how many tasks any particular person can take on, and using that data to extrapolate future capacity planning. So just wanted to reiterate two side points. Not everything, there's not always going to be data available. So what estimate using intuition is it allows you to kind of quantify your assumptions. And then as soon as you do that, you should collect data to validate. So on the consumer side, they have the luxury of A/B testing, especially if you have a fairly sizable user base that's growing, then you can A/B test and get validation pretty quickly. But if you don't, and my time at Wish, I worked on a lot of back office, like heavy stuff on logistics, customer service. These are projects that take years to fully execute. So how do you then validate? And our method was get to the MVP as fast as possible. Scrap out some sort of simple deliverable that you can show users in maybe a week. You don't even have to build anything. Just create a process for people to follow and contact your users and kind of follow the steps in this process. Collect data using Excel spreadsheets. But the important thing is to validate quickly to see where you can double down. So that's kind of the foundation of things. Everything starts from knowing the impact of your actions, and data-driven companies know their impact from metrics. And if not from metrics, then from intuition built up from tons of decisions based around metrics. So yes, there's still a heavy intuition piece, but this intuition piece is built up from experience with data, not necessarily from anything else. For example, in like customer conversations and design thinking. So that foundation is set. I want to ask you guys the question of how do you now go from having zero capability to something like a Facebook or an Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, all of these big companies with like crazy large data functions at scale that argue seemingly very effectively. Do you do it by like copying this painting one-to-one, disappearing for a while and then coming back and it's like, here's your giant data team? Or do you set it up in a way that you deliver value every step along the way? It's a pretty contrived A or B, obviously B. So once you have impact and everyone is used to defining impact for their work, then you can prioritize using it. So all these are the 3 bullet points down are different questions you can have in your head when growing out a data team. How do you decide which ones to take on? And the equation that I use is based on 3 factors. 1, what is the expected impact to the company? 2 is the risk of failure. And the 3rd is the amount of work that we're going to do. So if you apply this prioritization framework, then you can apply it to different types of questions. The first one is interesting because a lot of people downplay, doing an endless set of data requests. But if you think about it, these requests are super low risk because someone's asking you for help, and hopefully they've qualified the request a little bit, and that plus a little bit of your own qualification, means guaranteed impact. Even if it's minuscule, you can pump these out so quickly that this is essentially the bread and butter. As long as you do spend a portion of your time doing this, then you ensure that the analytics function can at least deliver some value. And over time, this value should add up into a sizable impact. The second one, kind of varies from project to project, but usually strategic projects have a lot higher risk. So you can't, solely, focus on these. It kind of has to be a mix of other stuff too. The third one I get asked a lot, like when I was at 500 Pixels, and I wrote that blog post detailing what we did, and I highlighted, evangelize data. Does evangelization, is that impactful? If you think about it, it's fairly high risk, since you don't know if the impact will be positive, that the teaching that you tell other people, here's how you use the data, that teaching will actually be used in the correct way, or in a way that adds value to the company. It's in terms of like documenting your data warehouse, that's also high risk. You might do a ton of work, have it not be used, and then have to redo it as the data warehouse changes. So tasks like these, I would put some more focus in evaluation. And if the three variables aren't clear, especially impact is kind of sometimes hard to state right away. You have to spend some time thinking through this. So what is the exact impact that this project will have? Sometimes it's not clear, especially for infrastructure projects. So really have to think through the quantitative impact that it will have, whether it's reduction of work, improvement of efficiency, and estimate some numbers and validate. So number 3, just some points on project management. It kind of puzzles me when I talk to people working on data teams, and I ask, like, how are you guys tracking your work? And the response oftentimes is just, oh, people send us emails and we'll, deliver work in response. And to me, this is an opportunity lost, because with a ticketing system, you can gather a lot of data to help you decide what to do in the future. Take a page from engineering, work in sprints. For every request that comes in, it should appear in the form of a ticket inside a ticketing system. And over time, you have things like work estimation per analyst, work estimation per data engineer. You have data to allow you to forecast how much a future piece of work is going to be. And then you can use all this to do sprint planning, to do headcount, to forecast headcount, to justify adding new headcount, and to make your justification a little bit more quantitative. So just simple point, just use a ticketing system and make sure that you have the diligence to put everything in there. This is also important when you're adding people, because it's a lot easier to shift tickets and shift assignment of tickets. For example, if you have a system where tickets go through certain individuals, you can just make a simple change. And let's say adding another person, you can just change it so that tickets flow to someone else once they're onboarded. And it just makes onboarding a lot easier as well. So use a ticketing system. A little less, tools based. Sometimes I talk to people about how they're building out data teams, and one thing I see is like, so I ask, hey, what's the roadmap? And they're like, okay, You're going to spend 3 months talking to people, figure out requirements, and then kind of build everything out or as a design, and then we're going to implement. And that's a huge red flag. Anytime you see waterfall as a type of execution strategy, it's a huge red flag, because data projects can be broken down, and the MVP can be built out very quickly. Whether it's an analysis, whether it's a data warehouse, tooling has gotten so good nowadays that you can just pick and choose from different vendors. Because it's in the cloud, hopefully you're on AWS or Google Cloud. If so, then you can actually prototype one of these things in like a week, and you can put the most important tables in, and then see what the result is, see how people are using it, and week over week you can add more into it, so that you can prioritize effectively based on what the most urgent stuff that needs to be put in. And it's not always clear from the get-go. Right? No, there's that saying, no plan survives contact with reality. Same with analysis. It's really easy for analysts to kind of go down the rabbit hole and to kind of lose sight of the end goal and get too granular. So the biggest impact to changing the system will come from really broad strokes. And if those aren't possible, then you need to reevaluate. So force people to work in sprints and try to get something out to users as soon as possible. Avoid the waterfall method, which I think is pretty popular in analytics. Let's see, implicit operational tasks. Lastly, I wanted to give an example of something that at least happened to me, and a lesson learned is that processes are everything when growing. So self-serve BI tooling, seems really great at first. And it is when the company is small, because you have relationships with everyone. People come to you for advice on how to use it. You help people, and then over time you train people to kind of use these tools effectively, and everyone can kind of create data for themselves. And that's what happened at 500 Pixels. So I implemented that. I wish, there's some hesitation around opening up our business intelligence tool. It's like, no way, just like let everyone have access to the data. Democratization is like the best way to go. But then the company grows, and it grows and grows and grows, and eventually there's teams hiring data analysts that like I don't even know, and then so the company grows beyond just yourself, and you lose control of kind of the tooling and the infrastructure that you've originally set up, which is not a bad thing. It just happens, right? That means it's useful and people want to use it. But if you don't have proper processes, then you lose total control, and all the different affordances that your system can do, people will start, if it's possible, they'll try it. And this can lead to issues. For example, opening up BI, and as the company grew, there would be a lot of incorrect data being pulled, either from a lack of understanding of metrics or a lack of understanding over data sources. Not people's fault, because there's no processes built around these things. So you get calls from like 2 a.m. from the CEO saying like, why are we losing X dollars? Well, we're not on this, particular project. And there'd be a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos, and negative value. That's negative value. So the system is now generating negative value. So we kind of closed it off. So the lesson learned is think about all the different implicit actions that you're doing right now, and think about how that's going to happen, when the company 5Xs. And these are the kind of things that you need to codify into processes. Maybe it's going to HR and baking that into the onboarding process. How do you ensure data quality in a company where data teams will pop up in places that you didn't know require data teams? And they'll be using the stuff that you've built, but then how do you ensure proper data quality? So take some time and think about all these different processes. So now onwards to hiring, the main point I wanted to make here is that there's two very distinct skill sets in analytics. One is the engineering side. So the engineering side is the ability to think about growing these systems in a scalable way, in a maintainable way, and being able to build proper monitoring. So it's thinking about the system in terms of actual engineering, in terms of how the company functions, works, what are the different events and actions that happen, and then abstracting that also into data models. That's what makes a successful engineer. And for an analyst, being super close to the business, understanding the business, the impact, being very detail-oriented, not being afraid to drill down into every single dimension because there might be different behavior in each, and be really diligent about the quality of data that you push out. So two very different skill sets. I personally can't do both. If I switch into data analyst mode, I'll be in analyst mode for a week before I can switch back into engineering mode, and vice versa. So anytime someone tries to do both, some issues happen, like either quality slips or speed slips. So because of these two skill sets, just make sure to hire both. And when starting out a new team, I would say maybe hire the engineer first, a little bit, but as soon as possible, add an analyst. And I don't think this needs to be reinforced, but in the beginning, infrastructure is really, really bare bones. The only people that are able to kind of handle bare bones infrastructure is more senior people with the experience and kind of habits they built into themselves to make sure they don't get burned by sending out incorrect data. So in the beginning, you really need proven hires. Not too senior that they forget what it's like to be an individual contributor, but way more senior than entry level. So one mistake that I see is that whoever manages the data engineering team and whoever they report to needs to know what makes a successful data engineer. And not every head of eng has empathy. What makes good data engineering, being able to understand and generalize business logic really well, build out these data models really well, that is kind of orthogonal to core infrastructure, to like scaling out massive services with proper monitoring. So having leadership that understands the plight of the data engineer, especially when the end result of data engineering is not immediately clear. For example, it's easier on the data analyst side to get promoted because you can help out with a major project and you can perform analysis that goes into major decisions and you can kind of quantify your impact. Much harder with data engineering. So if you want a strong data engineering team where people will stick around and it's easier to hire talent, you really need someone that understands what goes into good data engineering. So put some thought into that. On the analyst side, I would say, I wish we had the split between embedded analysts and our own analytics org, analyst org. For embedded analyst, I'll just make one note. When you put people on business teams and they report to like a head of X or a director of X, and most of their work and context and valuation is done by that person, you need to make sure there's a counterbalance, that the analyst is being used effectively. It's very easy to get into these like vanity metrics of, you're being effective just because you're giving people what they want. And what they want is just, everyone is comfortable with a lot of data. So they ask for a lot of dashboards, they get them, and then they evaluate the analysts really well. But the end result is minimal because, that just made people more comfortable. not too many impactful decisions were made from this data. So there needs to be a counterbalance of someone that's like, hey, this is how you actually make impact with this data, and you need to change the behavior of this group. So not having total evaluation to the head of business that the analyst is assigned to, but also some central, experienced manager that can make sure the impact is there. So lastly, I want to go over some pitfalls. So let's go to the first point. If you're a company that gets here, that decides, okay, we want to be data-driven and everyone's going to communicate in terms of impact, and you start treating this like dogma, like this is the absolute truth. Data is the absolute truth. So, I don't even care about what you're telling me until you give me some numbers. That slows things down, right? So this is hard to do, but you have to trust, especially experienced hires, their intuition, because this intuition, is very valuable. You can't expect everyone to kind of recreate arguments for how things should be done from first principles. So if you do, things will kind of slow down, and this will be uncomfortable for a lot of people that aren't used to this. And some people may have to leave the company. So there has to be a balance of someone's previous intuition from prior work and some trust of existing best practices beyond this company versus the data-driven arguments and the experimentation that goes on within. Because too much of intuition and you start getting into making poor decisions, too much of rigorous data, you make really good decisions, but you really slow things down when you could have just skipped like 3 steps because someone's already done it before. This is a big one. So if data is, this is the biggest risk I would say is if prioritization and decisions are being made by these very simple analysis done on impact, it's very easy to sacrifice long-term growth for short-term growth. So ignoring second order effects, it might not be possible to include churn not churn, but retention on the impact of some work, because retention takes maybe 8 months, a year. And a lot of the times you can frame arguments in a way that only states positive impact and kind of downplays the negative. So as the company scales and everyone has this behavior, negative things that have negative impact, like more negative impact than positive impact, can kind of slip in, that they seem like these teams or projects are doing positive to the company and the growth of the company, but the overall impact is negative or can be quite negative. So there needs to be some de-risking of this. This always happens. So how do you counter that? And my thought is, we didn't do it at Wish, but some sort of strategy team to kind of look at all the different risks that the company has kind of embedded into their assumptions about how they operate. Look at the trade-offs that are being made and see, are these trade-offs a net positive? These things take a lot of work. They also take a lot of time, especially to gather data, but it's super critical to kind of balance the short-term bias of a data-driven company. Okay, those were my 5 points. Promised 5 points, delivered. So that's kind of the talk. We're going to go into Q&A mode, but just to give a plug, I joined the Canadian Data Exchange as a mentor. So if you want mentorship, totally free to Canadian companies, just go on that page, use the forum. I'm not on the page yet, just pretend like I am, and just use the forum, and we'll get in touch. Cool. Thank you for listening. put myself back on. I can hear you, yeah. Jacqueline is talking. Okay. So if you have questions right now for a live stream Q&A, just post them under the live stream. There should be a box, and that'll reach Jacqueline, which will then narrate to me. Okay. Ask me anything. AMA. Ooh, I got a question. Do I have any examples of anyone using intuition for estimates? So intuition is best built from experience with the system. So the question is, do I have any examples of anyone using intuition to build estimates for impact? So intuition, it has to be built up by prior experience. So either you've worked on this particular problem before or a type of problem. The estimates that I keep repeating when I was at Wish was policy decisions. So let's say we change the policy and this is the amount of merchants that will happen. I would say X% of them would follow, X% won't, and then the ones that will follow will drop due to just testing, whether your policy is like super strict or not. So it's kind of hard to give very specific examples, mostly around, these were specific things that we did at Wish. And so, fortunately not, but I would say just base that off prior experience on the same type of problem. If not, it's okay to just give a number, because if anything, that just shows like your base expectations. Just even if you have no data, just put a number down and then have that update over time. And that will give you a sense of how much you yourself believe in the expected impact. Cool. So in terms of challenging, the thing about Wish was that being challenged by the data is expected. So you need a culture where it's expected that if you find something in the data that tells you something that you're wrong, then that's like a gold mine. That's like a piece of gold. Sorry, I'm going to repeat the question. Do I have any examples of incidents where a piece of data challenge someone in senior leadership and essentially prove them wrong, do I have any examples of that? And I would argue that I do, and ideally, and this happened at Wish, you're in an org where a piece of data that challenges someone is a piece of gold. Where this is challenging is there's a lot of resources put into a project, or maybe personal capital by a senior leader into a particular project that needs to succeed. And unfortunately, this is just politics. If someone needs a project to succeed, then you bring it up, and it will still be hard to kind of push through. So I would say I don't have the solution to that. Hopefully, there's a culture where if there's not as much personal investment, you can challenge and you can kill projects based on that piece of challenging information. So maybe the ideal route is to just kind of bake that in, bake failure in. A lot of the projects that we put into engineering actually ended up failing. So our practice was just double down on other projects. But it's different from team to team, because for the engineering, we have like 1 million projects. And if some fail, that's okay. But for other teams, if it's their only project for the quarter and it's like a major OKR and the metrics say, hey, this isn't exactly working, that's a more challenging situation to be in. And it's not exactly clear if there's a cookie cutter response. Sure. So the question is, how do my principles apply to a well-founded data organization that is only now looking to become data-driven? So how do you essentially make a company data-driven when it's not before? It would start from the top. If the CEO and founders require that things be properly communicated in terms of impact, then that makes, I'm not going to make a decision on this until you tell me the impact. And then I'm also going to communicate what we're doing in terms of impact to the rest of the company. So if the CEO, CTO, the senior leadership, they start using this framework, it has to start from the top. That'll just trickle down, and eventually managers will get the hint that nothing they push up, no request will get done until they put some work and thinking behind it in terms of data. That just trickles down to the rest of the company. It's very hard to do the opposite, where you want to make the company data driven, but just from the opposite was myself at 500 pixels. Giving people access to data, giving people a bunch of dashboards, that doesn't really help. That's a vanity metric when it comes to making companies data driven. Data driven has to be rooted in prioritization, and that really can only come from the very top, because otherwise, why do people care? If they can get projects pushed through or headcount added without requiring these data-driven arguments, then people follow the easiest way. Data-driven is way harder to do than the converse, just running off intuition. So there's definitely cost, and has to be imposed kind of by leadership as a discipline. So if you want to make your company data-driven and you're in senior leadership, then start applying prioritization using impact. Great. Until that's all the questions we have. So thank you very much for listening. Really happy to be here, and hope you guys reach out, and maybe we can get in touch about problems that you guys might have. So I think we're going to post the slides. Talk to you guys later.